All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the DC iOS and iOSoho joint meetup. So this is the first for both of us. Neither of us has had a meetup in a little while, and we decided we wanted to run one together. So it's a good way for us to get started. So we just quick ground rules, and I'll talk for DC iOS, and I'll let Paul say anything he wants to say for iOSoho. So obviously we have a great speaker tonight, and then a very interesting talk from what it seems like. So, just the usual rules, just, be respectful, be courteous. If you have any questions, leave them in the chat, because we will, right now, unmuting is not enabled, but we will enable it at the end for Q&A, as well as for any of the follow-up breakout rooms. And just keep an eye out for what we'll have coming up for the next few months. All right, Paul, do you want to say anything?
Give me a quick second. I'm sorry I didn't get to get my slides on screen, but it doesn't matter. I'm just gonna say it and put myself on screen as well. Yeah, hello everybody. I mean, you said everything already. Like, this is our first time, I think the first time for iOSoho as well, to do a partnership with a meetup from a different city. We have done that in the past. We have a few meetups in New York, and we try different partnerships. We, for example, have a end of year party where we all hang out together. It's been a bit harder in the pandemic for sure. We hadn't had any meetup for a long time. The last one was probably 3 months ago, but typically iOSoho is a meetup that we have once a month, where we typically have 2 times 20-minute talks. So it's a very first for us, like doing it early, doing it longer, one longer talk. And we're very excited to partner with DC iOS. So welcome everybody for both communities. And we're going to start with the talk, as mentioned, and at the very end, we'll have a little bit of announcements from us and from the group. If you'd like to announce something, talk about something, and share with the group, you're welcome to do so. You can start thinking about it now. And at the very end, after that, we'll go into a bit of networking session where we'll join breakout rooms and share with each other and get to know each other. But for the time being, plus I will give it to Krzysztof to talk about improving developer experience.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me correctly?
Yep, you're all good.
All right, cool. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. So today I want to talk about practical suggestions, techniques, and tools that can improve developer experience in our teams. I'm going to talk about a lot of stuff I worked on and some of the community work as well. So a little bit about me. I am a lead developer at the New York Times. I do a lot of consulting, so companies would hire me to do code reviews for their projects, like the whole holistic approach, or build teams, or build better workflows for improving efficiency of their developers, because that's what business is about. And I do a lot of open source. My open source powers up more than 70,000 native applications. So I spent over a decade working on tools and libraries that make life easier for Cocoa community. And so if people are familiar with some of my projects, this is just some of them. I actually have more, which is crazy. But all of them kind of focus on developer experience. If you look at the core driver, whether that's tools like playgrounds or file watchers, which I'm going to mention as well. But in general, that has been a very interesting thing for me, because I believe that's one of the cornerstones of how things should work.
Hey, Krzysztof.
So, yes?
Sorry to interrupt. Are you sharing something right now? Are you sharing the slides?
Yes, did it disappear?
Am I the only one to not see it, or?
Yeah, no, Krzysztof, I think when we started showing the other slides, they might have disappeared. You might need to.
Oh, okay.
We see you.
Let's see. Okay.
Perfect. We see them now.
Yeah, now you're good.
Sorry. Yeah, so this is some of the open source I do. All of those tools kind of focus on making us more efficient and a little bit more sane, because our tooling that comes from Apple is not perfect, as we all know. So improving developer experience, in my opinion, is one of the best investments we can make as developers, because it yields significant benefits to our teams. And before we start talking about how to do it or what those benefits are, let's look at the difference between a good and bad experience. So in my opinion, if you have a bad developer experience, you usually waste a lot of time doing things that aren't important to your business goals, which means dealing with bad tooling, architecture, or having to write boilerplate. So code that really makes you cringe, like, do I have to write it again and again and again, each project, or even, in the same project many, many times over. And because of those things, it also creates a very clear disconnect between the kind of work we want to be doing and the results we are seeing. So it's like an extra barrier for us to do our job well, and also to be satisfied when we do it. And that makes us inefficient, and it puts roadblocks in our way. And it's really easy with bad developer experience when you feel all of those feelings to make simple mistakes, really. Humans are peculiar like that. Machines don't make those mistakes. We do quite a lot if we are under pressure or stressed or just not happy in general. Whereas with good developer experience, it's the opposite, right? It allows us to work smart, not necessarily hard. It enables more efficient workflows. It makes it so much easier to us to be engaged in the kind of work that we are doing. And it focuses us on what really matters to our product and our business goals, rather than the shortcomings of our stack, the fact that our tooling isn't perfect, the fact we need to deal with all of this stuff every day, right? And because of that, it also limits the human mistakes because it eliminates all of those pain points. So because I've been doing this for a long time, I often come up with like an algorithm for myself to decide whether I should invest time into making a tool or a framework for myself or my team or my clients. And there's a couple of questions that I ask myself every time I face any problem, really. So is this inconvenient just for me? Is this like one-off situation? Or is this problem, whatever it is, whether that's, slow build times, whether that's, tooling that just doesn't help us but stands in our way. So is it for me just a peculiar problem, or is it something that my teammates or even people in the community face? How often does it happen? I mean, if it happens once every month, not a big deal, right? Probably not worth optimizing or automating because you're going to spend more time fixing it. Let's do some math, right? What's the total time we waste per week or per month of this kind of problem? And an example of something where I answered those questions was the fact that at the times we use a lot of internal and third-party tooling that run with each build. That is things like Swift Format, Sourcery, SwiftLint, and a couple other tools. And the total it adds to our build times 6 seconds, right? It's only 6 seconds, not a big deal in comparison with like Swift builds, right? Well, I actually measured how many times per day I build on average, and it's usually between 200 and 400 times. 90% of those times, I don't need to run those tools because they don't really do any changes. And we have over 30 developers touching the main application. We have many different teams, and people are working on a lot of A/B tests. So let's take the lower threshold. So 30 developers, 200 times, 6 seconds, and 90% of that, it's 9 hours wasted per day running tools that don't need to be run. That sounds like a really big waste, right? So 45 hours per week, if we can improve that, if we can get rid of that, it's like hiring a full-time developer, except the company doesn't have to pay for it. So it's definitely worth investing time to improve. And how did I do it? Well, I created custom pre-process scripts that run on pre-commit and also on CI to verify that nothing comes through that's negative. And you can read the details about that on my blog. I go into exact details, and I actually share the script that you can use to build your own. But it's a massive time save, right? So this is one of those problems that affect our developer experience, because wasting so much time just waiting for builds or waiting for tooling to execute that doesn't do anything, that's really not good, right? So let's look at some of the more common issues and things that happen in our workflows that could be improved. So the first thing that I really dislike is having to do manual steps when we try to reproduce problems or data. For example, if you need to fill in your login credentials to check feature in your application, and you are filling it by hand each time, that just doesn't seem efficient to me. And there are a couple of ways you can do it. You can use user breakpoints. They're really cool because they never leave your machine and they don't generate diffs. It's also easy to disable. So you can just, in your code, you can usually add this kind of breakpoint and enter an action that just changes the underlying value. And so when you go into login screen, it's already pre-filled with your data and doesn't affect anyone else in your team. But sometimes you're working on long-running features and you want to run some code, right? So ideally you want something like that, just side effects that just happen for one user. User breakpoints might not be enough here. And the easiest way to do it is to add a build phase script that allows you to create if branches for developer. So when you build the project, depending on whether it's you or your teammate, different definition will be bundled into your project and it will execute different code path. So that's convenient for testing long-running features. Another issue that I truly hate is long iteration cycles. And especially since we moved from Objective-C to Swift, that was very noticeable because Swift compile times have been so much worse than what we had in Objective-C. And so it's not just about the fact that we have to wait for the whole workflow. So you have to change the code, you have to build the project, you have to deploy it to simulate your device, and then you verify if your results worked, right? That's not the only problem. Another problem here is that wait time creates a disconnect. So if you're working, especially when you're working on like user experience or UI tweaks, I bet that if you have this roadblock, you will do less experimentation, you will tweak less because it's just painful to wait and wait and wait. And again, this is something I measured. So when I was working on my indie app, Foldify, the compile time wasn't that bad back then. It was 25 seconds to get the whole iteration. And on average, I was, let's say, 300 iterations, right? So that's 2 hours waiting for build times every single day. That's 1/4 of my paid time, right? That's not efficient at all. And it's just, I have better things to do in my life than watching the spinner. So there are many ways you can approach it. You can approach it from an architecture standpoint. You can divide your project into many different modules that don't need to change very often. And that's the easiest way to start working on it. There are a lot of benefits here because when you have to separate project into different modules, you have to think about the design of your architecture. And especially you have to think about the public APIs and boundaries of your modules. This also leads to better test suites. So you have smaller test cases and they run very fast because they are contained in your framework. And that also enables you to work with playgrounds or small sample projects. So in general, it makes you much more efficient. And there used to be a problem with dilip loading, but that's no longer really a major concern. And we also have static libraries, which alleviate that altogether. But sometimes you cannot split your project, or it's still too slow because you have too many of those frameworks. You have too much of a Swift code base or mixed code base. What can you do there? Well, there's a tool called injection for Xcode. And it's a tool that uses code injection. Back in Objective-C, it used Swizzling, but the new version of this project actually works very differently. It integrates with LLVM directly. It works with both Swift and Objective-C. And it used to have limitation on what you can inject with Swift language, but because they switched to LLVM interop, you can actually inject every single Swift object. So you can inject Swift UI and pure value types, which is very, very convenient. And even now, like recently, John, which is the author of this tool, he made it so that you can integrate it as SPM package. So you don't even need external application. You simply add it as a dependency to your project and you can start using it. And on top of that, I built something called KZ Playground back when original Swift came out. And that's basically like an architecture that worked in Swift and Objective-C, but also exposed a lot of DSL for you. So you could expose control variables. Rather than having just the code, you had actual visual cues that you could change and trigger side effects. And it was very easy to add because it's a framework. Still works. can still use it, and it works with injection for Xcode. Probably, if you're using Swift UI, probably don't need it, but as you can see in this demo, it was very convenient. And the nice thing about using tools like this is that the recompilation takes less than a second, and you don't need to relaunch your application or simulator. So even if Swift improved their build times, you still have the additional cost of actually having to deploy it to actual simulator or device and launch it and get to a specific screen. Versus if you use injection for Xcode or Playgrounds, you don't need to do that. You can keep working on the same screen, keep working on the same state even, because you can expose state not to be the code that gets injected, and you can iterate extremely fast, it's just really convenient, and it makes it so much easier to experiment and tweak your user interface, and especially interactions and animations. Another issue that's very common is retain cycles. Anyone that works still with UIKit, which is most of us, because Swift UI is so buggy, we use a lot of closures, right? Closures cause a lot of retain cycles, and Apple gives us some tools. They gave us the ability to use memory graph debugger or leaks instruments. They don't work always correctly. And the other bigger problem with that is you actually have to trust people to run those tools before submitting every single PR. Because the problem is, if you have a lot of changes in your code base, and then you realize that you had memory leak, finding those leaks is not an easy task. If you had a small diff, probably pretty straightforward to review that, right? But if the last time that you checked was a few weeks ago and you have a decent sized code base, well, good luck finding that, especially with things like closures. So humans are not very reliable, and it's very easy to skip things like that, especially when you feel pressure from your product or your higher ups. You need to deploy, you need to release this feature, we are waiting for it. So people cut corners, and that's a real issue, right? And so what you can do? Well, we had this issue at the times, and I remember I had to fix retain cycles every few weeks, because whenever I fixed it, someone else just added new ones. And then I had to spend few hours each time to figure out what the diff was, where I had to do bisect to find the alleviate the issue. And it was just really, really inconvenient and annoying to me, and something that happened to all of us. And the biggest problem was that we learned about that usually because we got like memory crashes, or the clients in production would report problems. So I came up with this simple idea that in most applications, you can usually tell how many instances of a given object you can have at any given time, because many of the screens we have in our application can only live in like one instance or like two instances. Usually, like the most common stairs is just one instance of a specific class, right? So I built this kind of tool that lives on this simple premise, but it also adds some UIs to be able to inform the developer. And the reason for that is this runs every time the application is running, this is tracking the count of the objects, right? If the count ever gets over what you thought it should be, so if you thought there's going to be only one instance, you will get a visual pop-up saying that there is a retain cycle. And what this caused for us is the fact that we now get notified pretty soon in our development process that we caused an issue. So we don't have to wait weeks until we find the reason. And this is a simple premise, so it works in both languages and mixed code bases. And yeah, the ability to be warned before you have to actually manually try to figure out if you had any retain cycles is extremely convenient, and it saved us weeks of time. And honestly, I did it a few years back, and since then I don't remember a single time we actually had to go and use memory graph debugger because we never got reports about massive leaks and stuff like that. And whenever we work on features and something is off, the pop-up comes out, and like we found so many different scenarios. Like we had a situation where our ads were leaking, and that's like a very big problem because ads are web views. So very, very costly. And people working on different features would find that there is an issue, which is very convenient. And the integration is really simple. You simply specify configuration, which is the maximum count of your objects, and you can also group items. So you can do a little, more complex setup if you want to. And the other thing you have to call is from your initializer, you just call track lifetime. This is all open source. There is even an integration for danger that verifies that you didn't forget to call track lifetime. So the moment you use a lifetime tracker, you get, it's not compile time, but it's almost compile time. When you do a PR, you'll get warned if you forgot to call this method. So very convenient and massive time saver for us. Another issue that I often hear in my career is that people say that they're blocked. They cannot work on a feature because API is not ready, or they cannot structure their code because they cannot test it. I really don't like this idea, because most of the time I finish native part before the backend even gets started. I just agree on a contract with them and then I write it against tests. But how can you do that even if you don't do testing? So the common goal is to design your processing like a pipeline. And with Swift, you probably have a protocol at each stage, right? So you have some kind of data provider, you have some kind of decoding logic, you get Swift models, and you get a consumer, which might be your view model, for example. So if you do any testing, you always have to do this kind of setup either way, right? Whether you want to use developer tooling or not. So let's say for testing, you want to verify that with given fake data, you reproduce the problem that the user had, right? So you just get that chain, you cut it in half, and you change model converter into returning a fake models. So just a stop, basically. And this can be used not just for TDD, but you can also use it to create screen with fake data to verify your UI and stuff like that. Pretty simple. But the problem is, most of our bugs don't happen in static data scenario. The root of all evil is usually mutable state. That's usually where all of the problems appear. So when we were writing section front, which is basically our main homepage at the times, we didn't have servers ready. The servers were far from being ready because we were rewriting the application. When I joined, I joined to lead the New York Times. And so we wanted to work on the features, but the server wasn't going to be ready in a very long time. And obviously we could have done unit tests to check components of the application and see that each particular part works, or we could have stored a JSON file on some server and then change it manually and reload the application. But not only would that be tedious, but it also meant a very long iteration cycle. And as I mentioned before, we want to cut that out, right? We want as real time as we can get. And the other thing is, if we had just a static file somewhere, it doesn't allow us to observe changes in real time, and we avoid the mutable state, which is where usually the problems are. So it only validates the initial load, and that's not really helpful. What we want to be able to do is we want to load external data into application. And when you're running on simulator, that can be as simple as loading from a file on your Mac. And when you're running on device, you need to load it from network resource because you don't have your desktop. And you want the real-time updates, right? So I built this small tool called File Watchers. And it's a generic implementation that supports both etags and if modified since, works obviously in both languages. And it simply exposes two interfaces you can use to observe file changes. Whether it's local or remote, you simply use this instance or that instance. It looks the same from the end user perspective. And the way you integrate that into your pipeline is by simply changing your data provider to a file watcher. And for us, it was like 4 lines of code to integrate. And this is how section front looked like when we did it. So that was, we had a massive JSON file that we were using File Watcher to observe, and we were working on the designs. So as you can see, the app looks much better now. but we got real-time updates. So whenever I replaced something in the file, I immediately got the results in the application. So I could verify state mutations, and I could make sure that, you know, we don't cause some kind of weird issues. And if you cannot reproduce bugs because your data changes often, it's another big issue related to our data processing. For applications like the Times, where the news changes, you know, a lot. Every day, there are multiple updates, there's many different articles. So the user can be in there's a lot of permutations of state for the user. And so the problem is, if I get a bug report, usually like you don't get to the bug the same day, you don't get to it usually the same week, probably takes a few weeks to get through the client report to the developers. By that time, that data is somewhere else. It's probably somewhere on the server, but it's really hard to find it. And with, you know, complex layouts, like we had probably like 30 different ways to display an article. Yeah, finding the right one was really problematic. So we were supposed to have a server component that lets us grab snapshots, but that never happened. Our backend never implemented that. So I started thinking about, well, not only are we wasting time by having those bugs that we cannot really reproduce, that's the other issue, right? So we're wasting time trying to reproduce it, and oftentimes we cannot, because we just cannot get into the same kind of state that the user was in. So again, simple principle. You can build an architecture that allows you to do a lot. Like you can build an architecture that has this idea of recording data and all this stuff, but that's when you start. Usually when you're in the middle of your project or the project already exists, you need to look for pragmatic solutions. So the first thing that comes to mind is the fact that no matter what your application does, there is always a point where you deal with raw NS data, right? Doesn't matter if it's Tinder, Bumble, New York Times, MindNote, anything else. If there is any server component, you always have a point where you deal with raw bytes. So you usually can assign an identifier to that data because you have limited set of endpoints, right? So what if you have a function that you pipe your data through? You pass in the data, you pass in the identifier, and you get the data back. So regardless of your app architecture, let's put this function where you have that data object, and let's put the data that you get from the server into this function, but let the rest of the application use the data that's returned from it. So it's a single line of code change at your networking layer, usually. But what it allows you to do, if the app is recording mode, it persists that data into some kind of cache, so some folder on disk usually. And if you're in reproduction mode, instead of recording that data, you dismiss the current data and you return to the user the data that was cached before. So let's say a user was facing a problem in the application and they shake their phone under whatever the way you use to report issues. The application by default in like beta mode records all of the data. When the user shakes the phone, we zip that data, we send it to our S3 bucket, and we obviously generate a unique identifier, and we attach that unique identifier to our bug report. When the developer, a month later, gets into the bug reproduction, they don't need to care about what the data was. They only grab the identifier, go into our beta settings, put in that identifier into our beta settings, and the application now loads that zip from the S3 bucket, changes the application mode into replay mode, and simply requeries. When it requeries the data that comes from the server, we're doing a wasteful operation here, doesn't really matter, but we are downloading the data that we just dismissed, and we return the data that we just downloaded. And now the user, which is the programmer, has exactly the same data that our user a month ago had. And that can lead to us being able to reproduce 95% of issues. The only time we cannot reproduce issues is if our models change significantly and we simply cannot decode it. That doesn't happen that often in a mature application. And I have more details about that written on my blog, so you can go and read about that. But this has worked so well. Everyone in Times uses this, and it's definitely gonna be used in our other products, other apps we are working on. So very simple idea, similar how lifetime tracker was based on the notion that you have the knowledge of how many objects can live in your application. Here it's just a function that you pipe data through. And doesn't matter what your architecture is, it's just one line change and it's working. And it almost always works. So pretty powerful for something that took me a few hours to write. And if you really need more power, you can do something like leverage unidirectional architecture. So this actually works quite a bit different, the demo, but you can do the same with architectures like Redux or the composable architecture from point 3. What I did here, this is actually back in iOS 7, was back in Objective-C. I used runtime to be able to record actions of the user. So it wasn't architecture driven, it was very heavily runtime driven. It's much simpler if you use Redux than if you try to do magic with runtime. But you can do the same stuff. So here I have a time travel. I am able to reproduce every user action, and I have every user data recorded. So this reproduces even more potential bugs. And with architecture like Redux, what you can do is you can, if you have a crash, you simply load the data that the user had, and you load the actions that they did, and you load all of, like, you execute all of the actions until the last one. And when you because obviously when you execute the last one, the application will crash. So you have debugger connected, and then you can execute that last action, and you can see exactly where it is. You don't even need to have the symbols, because you can reproduce it on your actual device. So I love those kind of architectures. Let's talk about testing. I really like testing, especially when Xcode gives me a wall of text like this. So the way you get XTT asserts is basically, it just dumps everything, right? It just prints the whole object. So if you're writing simple tests, or you have a lot of isolation and you just testing primitives, that's fine. If you're just printing an int variable, that's okay. If you work on more complex data points, like for example, one of my projects is a code generator, and I need to compare AST models. AST models are not single properties. It's very complex. So if this is what I'm seeing, it's gonna take me longer to understand why my test failed than to fix it. That's not very convenient. So I really didn't like this. So what I did is I built a very simple framework based on mirror. And this is the difference. This is the same object, basically. Well, maybe not the same object, but the same kind of size of an object. And the only change you have to do in your project is you include this as an SPM package, and you add a single function for assert that just changes the assertion to generate diff automatically. What it does is inspects collections and simple types and generates the exact difference. So if you have one property that's different in your object of like 100 properties with sub-objects and everything else, Xcode will give you this, and difference will give you this. So here you can easily see which exact part of your object was wrong. So when you see a message like that, fixing the problem is much, much faster. Another issue with tests is the fact that we have to write mocks, and that is a lot of boilerplate. So there are a couple of ways to do it. There is a library called SwiftMocky, and it's based on my tool called Sourcery. And it generates this kind of API, which is really cool. If you ever use OC Mockito or one of the older Objective-C values, you had similar kind of interface, except this is Swifty. And there's a simpler way to use Sourcery. There is a bundle template that it comes with called automockable, and generates just basic wrapper. So either one would work. The way they work is continuous integration. So it's added to your project, and whenever your protocol changes, the mock gets updated automatically with it, which is very nice. But not everyone can do that. So I recently released a tool called Sourcery Pro, and it extends your Xcode with the ability to write live templates. So you no longer have to write your protocol mocks, you simply click a shortcut and the mock gets generated for you, even if your company doesn't use Sourcery. Very simple to use. As you can see, there's a lot of code that it generates from a couple lines of a mock. And if you are writing this by hand, you're just wasting your time. The other thing is, if you're writing this by hand, it's probably not very consistent. And if it's not very consistent, it's not the best for your team, right? You want to have the same kind of design for the same kind of objects. So better to use tooling. So we are going into the issue that I am most passionate about, which is boilerplate code, and the fact that when we write this kind of code, we don't think about the developer experience. 99% of time, there should not be those kind of repetitions that everyone in your team has to write. So when I created a tool before called Sourcery, Swift doesn't have equality or hashing derived implementations. We had to write all of that by hand, right? It was 2016. And everyone started using my tool. And so Apple added derived implementation because Ted and other people at Apple followed me. And it was funny because they were people at Apple were sending me Git patches on Twitter in private messages because they couldn't admit that they were using it and they couldn't contribute. Because when you are at Apple, you don't really do open source outside of Apple. So since then, this project has been used by over 40,000 applications. And so the way Sourcery works, it's like a preprocessor. You give it as an input, you give it Swift, and from that, it can generate more Swift or anything else, really. So I know of people that generate Kotlin from Swift, generate JS from Swift, or both, to have like Swift as a source of truth, and then generate multi-platform synchronization for different features. And this is used in projects like Airbnb, Bumble, massive code bases. So millions of lines of code, each project. And it also adds annotations to the Swift language. So something that Java and Kotlin has, we don't. With Sourcery, you actually do get annotations, which means that you can add extra fine-grained control over the code it generates, which is very convenient. And if you can describe an algorithm to another human, what you want to do, you can do it with Sourcery. You can automate it with Sourcery. So here's an example of inspecting one of the code bases I worked on. And as I type, again, I like as close as you can get to real time. So as I write and save the file, it regenerates. So it's extremely fast. And I want to show you a couple of examples of how Sourcery can be used. So obviously it can be used for simple boilerplate like equality, hashing. Obviously at this point, don't use it for that because Apple already copied that. But mocks are a good example. But there are a lot of more interesting features you can use Sourcery for that are more aligned with our topic, which is how can we use this kind of tool to improve our developer experience and to limit the amount of work that our developers have to do, a work that is usually unnecessary. So let's look at a couple of examples. So let's start with a project that I open sourced a few months ago. So we have this project called Automatic Settings. And the way it works is the UI on the right is not written by a human. What the developers did is write the code on the left. And that's literally all the code they wrote. And I created a template that turns arbitrary Swift structure into Swift UI editor. So a property grid of sorts. And you can use it without any annotations, just pure Swift structure. But you can also use the fact that Sourcery extends your Swift language with annotations and add extra customization. So for example, here in this example, you can see we have a section called smoothing, and it has annotation that says inject footer. The way that works is it will try to call a method on a specific class that's like generated by Sourcery, and the developers can add simply a single function that returns Swift UI view, and that will get injected into the UI. Everything else is generated automatically. So there is literally no code that has to be written here, except one function, which just returns a footer. And in our case, that function simply returns a button, I think, here. So this supports nesting, so you can have sections, as you can see here. Like you can do as much nesting as you want. And this powers up all of the beta settings in the New York Times application. And there are over 100, and there are over like, I think 12 sections. There's a lot of code. It's thousands of lines of code that's generated for our developers. What's really cool about this is if you're working on our code base and product asks you to add some kind of beta settings. So let's say, they want to control the animation easing, whether it's using linear or whether it's using ease in or ease out. Normally to get a UI to control which mode it is, well, you first have to add data. You have to persist that data somewhere, and then you have to create UI binding that exposes it, right? Quite a lot of different tasks you have to do. With automatic settings, the only thing you have to do is add a variable to your structure and compile the project. And there's no other code you have to touch. And the UI is already there. The UI is already ready for review. As you can see in this demo, when I change stuff, they don't change immediately. Instead, they're set as transaction, so you can review what you changed before you approve it. This is very convenient from user perspective, but also, it's fully automated again. So very powerful, massive time save. Another example that I built for us is we do a lot of testing, and we have hundreds of A/B tests in our application. Now, just having the allocation is pretty straightforward. But when you are a developer or where you are in QA, you want to be able to override your allocation, because the application will give you, it will put you in control, or it will put you in a specific variant. But that often means that you cannot test a specific feature. That's not very convenient. And especially when you have many tests, you have to assign yourself to very specific scenarios to be able to test all of the flows. So the way I build it for us is we have a structure called A/B tests. And if you want to add a new test to our application, you simply add a new variable like this. You add this is a generic variable. You pass in, as the generic, you pass in the enum variant. So it's basically enum that has a list of variants, and you select the default. And that's all you do. Again, you add a variable to a structure, and this is all of the code that you have to write. From that code, you get connection to the parser. The A/B tests come from the server. So you get connection to the parsing logic automatically. You get the integration to the UI layer that automatically generates overrides for you and lets you change everything. A single line of code, usually. Pretty cool, right? Another thing that I built back when ARKit came out, I designed an architecture for our journalists so they can write kind of like games. They can write AR experiences with full scripting. And so we needed a way to communicate between JavaScript and native layers. And the way it works on iOS, it's you have an enumeration that contains cases with associated values. Those associated values can be of any type that can be encoded. And one case is basically one command. What's really cool about it is, as a developer, if you want to add a new command to the bridge, you simply add a new case, you compile the project, and the compiler will tell you where you didn't handle that case. So the switch at the bottom here, that's how you handle commands coming from JavaScript. This is all of the code that the developer ever uses. There is nothing else that they touch. And at the place where you switch over the command that came from the JS side, you have fully materialized types. So your enum, even if it's using like here, I'm using material properties, which is like a custom object we have. At this point, it's all typed. There is no type conversion you have to ever deal with. You don't even need to know how the underlying bridge works, how the communication layer works. It's all generated. Simply add a case or change case values and use those commands. Pretty powerful. It was funny because when we were working on this feature and they would have a call with us asking for some new commands, like, so, you know, they can show particles so they can do more animations. I was finishing those features before we finished the meeting. And the way they looked when I told them, like, it's already there, it's already published, priceless. And I don't know if you will be able to hear audio. I recorded a demo of an architecture, a component-based architecture that uses Sourcery very heavily. So let me know if the video isn't heard, and I'll just explain everything.
It's not going through.
Okay, that's fine. So here I have this is all I'm gonna touch. There is visual code open on a text file. There is a single file in Xcode, and there is the application currently running. The way this works is this is like a markdown enriched format. So I have text with special tags like you have on GitHub. And right now I'm only displaying a help component. It lists all of the components available in the application and all of their documentation. So I'm going to add a new component that displays SF symbols. I simply create new structure. I specify the kind, which is the name of the tag I want to use. And I add description, which just describes what this component is meant to do. Every component is supposed to have a payload, which is the data that the user can configure it with. And let's just use name here. You can ignore the errors because I code faster than Xcode can deal with. And the only thing I have to do here is create a view. It's using Swift UI for the view layer, just making it easy. So to create a view, I simply use image and use the system name. And I reference the payload. That's all of the code that I wrote. There's no other code related to this feature at all. And I rebuild the project. And I already see the symbol in the help documentation. I can already use that symbol from the markdown enriched editor. So I'm just going to grab some symbol. And whenever I save the file, it automatically reloads. Again, I love real-time programming. So let's say, you know, it's very small. So we want to add font size, right? And we want to make it optional, but we want to make it so that it folds back. So what we'll do is we'll simply make it a variable that has some default value, and then we'll use that value in our UI. What this does underneath, it basically tells the system that the font size is not required from the user. And if they don't provide it, we use 64. If we provide it, the value that we gave it will be used instead. When you're working with Swift UI, you usually want to do stuff like styling. The way styling works in Swift UI is by using environment. That's how we usually do it. So I'm just going to add a style structure. I'm going to specify the font size there. And with styles in the environment approach, you always have like a default. So when I do that, I decide that the payload no longer needs the default because I don't want a duplication. I don't want two sources of truth because that's just confusing. And to be able to use environment, obviously, I cannot just create a purely functional UI. I have to have a struct that wraps the view because our simple component is not the view. So what I do here is basically I just use a style. I don't actually write anything, right? I just added a structure, and then I will just use that style. I reformat the project, and I can rebuild it. And you can see here that if I change the data, it will use the current values correctly. What's really cool about this is I can now go to the view that wraps my architecture, and I can specify different styling. But I didn't write any of that code, right? The only code I wrote was that single file. So what happens here? There's a couple of different things. So I get documentation generated for me for my components. I get automatic registration in my architecture for parsing. I get automatic parsing, I get automatic registration, I get automatic style generation, and environment values automatically get injected simply by creating a single file and just following, deciding what I want in it. Everything else is generated for me. What's really powerful here is I can scale this project so I can add more developers and they don't have merge conflicts. Usually when you add developers, like, product managers think, well, we're going to add more developers and we're going to be more efficient, but you learn that there is a management overhead, there is merge conflicts, a lot of those issues. With this architecture, none of that exists because you can create a new component in your own file, you never touch anything else, and it simply gets injected everywhere. All of that logic works for you. So if I added 10 developers, they could each work on a different component, and there is no overhead. There's no management overhead. There's no merging overhead. It just works. And there's a lot of code. There's more generated code here than there is actual implementation. And that's how I think it should work. But a lot of people don't want to use, well, not a lot of people, because 40,000 apps use it. But there are people that don't want to use Sourcery, or they're afraid of using it because it's a dependency. So your team might not want to use it or don't know how to integrate it. You can always hire me to do that, but you get my point. So I created, last Friday, I released a project called Sourcery Pro. And it's by far the most powerful Xcode source extension that exists. What it does is basically gives you ability to write automation for all of the tasks you do. So you can generate enums with associated values, codable implementation. You can generate Swift UI forms. You can generate protocol mocks with a single click or a shortcut, because you can assign a keyboard shortcut in your projects. And your projects don't have to use Sourcery. No one in your project actually no one in your team has to know that you even have this, because this generates normal Swift code for you. And it comes bundled with a very powerful editor that even if you never wrote templates or never heard about Sourcery, it will guide you by the hand. It adds type information to language that normally doesn't have types. It has powerful inline documentation and code completion. And it's really efficient. It comes in with 11 templates that are bundled. You can use different color themes. It's like a fully fledged editor. And yeah, it's really, really powerful. So if you have any task that you have to do over and over again, like mocks, coding, encoding, or your specific architecture related boilerplate, you should really check this out, because this kind of kills all of the excuses people have for not using Sourcery, because this is no longer dependency. This just generates a code that you maintain. So the same way you do it right now, except you don't have to do it. You just generate it, and then you can maintain it. Even if you use Sourcery, this is really useful, because this opens up complete new set of use cases. Because not everything can be fully automated. Not everything can run as continuous update phase, but there is a lot of things that start with the same kind of pattern. So if you ever used Rails, they have the idea of Rails generators. So you basically start with a template that's based on the kind of data you have, and then you take it over. So with automatic settings, that makes a lot of sense for things that are not user-facing, like the beta settings, because even if something with the layout isn't perfect, that's fine. But when you're working on Swift UI for the user-facing stuff, maybe you want to start with a template that, creates all the bindings for your structure, like one of the templates we have, and then you just want to tweak it to your liking. So do one click and generate all of the wiring for yourself, and then take it over like you normally do. And this is available on App Store, and it costs $20. So unless you're making, $5 per hour, I think this is going to pay for itself in a matter of 1 or 2 days. And it's extremely powerful. Once you start writing your own templates, you can do things. It's pretty much limitless. You saw what I did with the architecture. This is what I built for my clients. I make their teams more efficient. And with this new application, writing templates has never been easier. It's really powerful. So to summarize, I think that creating a good developer experience should be one of the cornerstones of the way we design our applications. And when we consider this, the time that we invest into those kind of tooling and experiences, in my opinion, yields the biggest return of investments you can do for your business. As I showed you in the first example, I spent a few hours and saved the company 45 hours of developer time per week. How often can you do something like that? That's like hiring an extra developer for free for like 5 hours of my time. Crazy. And not only is it good for business, but it makes it, you don't know, your developers no longer waste time on things that are not related to the goals or the things that are fun for them, because no one wants to deal with the boilerplate. No one wants to deal with the tooling being lackluster. And there's this idea of a mythical developer, 10x developer. And in my opinion, if that person exists, it's not someone that's a brilliant, loner. The 10x developer is a person that can make 10 members of his team more efficient. So whenever you face some kind of pain and difficulty, ask yourself the kind of questions I queried at the beginning and see if the problem that you're facing is isolated, or maybe it's affecting other team members. Maybe it's affecting the whole community. And buy Sourcery Pro. It will save you a lot of time. Thank you.
You can hear the claps, but everybody is clapping right now.
One sec, I'll share that slide deck, Paul. So
before we go into that, should we do a little bit of Q&A? Is this okay?
Let's do a few Q&A. Either you can drop your questions in the chat, or if you raise your hand, we'll unmute you. And then when we go to the breakout rooms, we'll disable it so everyone can unmute, but just to make sure that just have some overlap. So if you want to either raise your hand or just type a question in chat. And we have the first question in the chat. Question: what's the best way to get started with understanding how Sourcery works and how to use it?
So there is a lot of documentation. There's a couple of articles in the main Sourcery repo. I think the easiest way to start understanding how to use it is honestly the new app, because it's isolated. So the way Sourcery Pro works is every template has its own sample code. Every template has its own configuration. And so you can basically describe the data that you want to run against, and see the results of your template live. And the editor guides you by the hand. So you don't even have to read the documentation of Sourcery, because it's inlined in the editor. And there is very powerful code completion. So you simply start like the template. When you create a new template, it starts with a main for loop over the types that are available to you. And you just press Ctrl-Alt, and it will tell you what kind of properties those types have. And so from that, you can very easily build your template.
Just a quick add-on to that. I shared in the Slack, in the chat, a link to a video of someone working at Peloton who actually used Sourcery extensively and gave a talk at iOSoho a couple of years back. This is a YouTube link. You could check that out. It will give you a different perspective of someone who is using it on a daily basis. It's very interesting.
Yeah, the experience changed quite a lot. So you mean Dalton, right?
Yeah, Dalton. It might not be all up to date, but I think it still gives you a very good idea of what.
It's a good talk. It's definitely a good talk. And it's nice. There were a couple of talks in the community about the tool I built. Honestly, I wanted to build this tool before the Pro version, but I originally used SourceKit, and SourceKit is a running daemon, so you couldn't really do it very well with the Xcode extension. But I recently rewrote the Sourcery parsing to be Swift syntax, which is much faster, but also runs very differently, and so I was able to build this tool.
All right.
Should I be picking questions, or do you want to?
I can read them off. I can read them off
Okay.
to help. So next question: with the user-specific if blocks, do you have any concerns about shipping code meant for testing?
Yeah. So the way I approach that is that those are usually in the integration branches that you have, people working in. I don't use this a lot anymore, but usually those were like side effects to open a specific screen so I can shortcut. So basically, like I was working on one particular screen for a while, and normally navigating to that screen required like 6 different steps. I just didn't really like it. So I had this kind of if statement that would just shortcut the navigation to present it modally. So it's not, definitely not something you want to ship. You can do it so that I like to automate stuff. Like I don't trust people. I don't trust myself. So I automate everything I can. So I have CI that makes sure that those things don't get merged into master. And simply when things is merged, like when people want to merge, it will just reject it. Yeah, Sourcery AI is like completely different thing. They just use the same name for many years. So if you just look at the Mac App Store, Sourcery Pro, and you'll find it. They are not on the App Store.
Okay, so that answers that question. I think then this will be the last one. Then we'll wrap up the announcements and go into networking in the breakout rooms. How do you bring folks up at the New York Times up to speed with how things work in the code base? And does this present a challenge for maintenance onboarding with regards to specifically the Sourcery usage?
Yeah. So I'll give you an example with the bridge, because that's one of the older features I did. I don't think it has ever had to change. I don't think we ever had to update the template. As the Sourcery, when I update Sourcery, I try to keep it consistent. The AST very rarely changes. We have docs describing how things work so people can learn. But one of the things here is normal developers don't need to do that. They don't need to touch that code, because the whole point of this is you focus on what matters for the work you are doing. So if you want to add an A/B test, you don't need to understand the A/B testing framework. You just need to understand the public-facing configuration you have to set up. And so the implementation detail is an implementation detail to the developers working on the project that are not responsible for those features. We do have documentation. We have a lot of documentation in case, I'm no longer there and someone else has to maintain it, but there are many people that can. And yeah, that's basically been approached. Like we are trying to make it so that everyone else is more efficient, so they don't need to think about those kind of concerns. And also because the way I design architectures, in my opinion, the best way to design an architecture is by making the right choices easier than the bad ones. And so by having this very simple, not like you don't have 5 different options to do things, you simply, the only option you have is simply add a variable. No one will try to do their own thing, because that's probably the easiest thing you could do as a programmer. So yeah, hasn't been a problem for us.
One last small question, then we'll move on. Do you have enterprise pricing options for Sourcery Pro?
Yeah, so I'm finishing 1.2 update, and then I'm gonna add outside App Store distribution for companies, because I've been asked by a lot of companies already for like today I got asked by 2 companies for like 30, 40 seats each company. So definitely coming in after 1.2.
Awesome. Well, thank you. That was an amazing talk, and I think hopefully we all enjoyed it and learned some interesting things today. So I'm going to go ahead, flip over and share screen to us, and then Paul, I know you had some announcements. I'll make 1 or 2, and then we will go on to the breakouts. All right.
Yes, thank you. Can you scroll? It's supposed to be like, you can scroll to the next slide. Just very quickly, as I said before, is this a new format for us, at least on iOSoho side? I'm interested in hearing some feedback. I will send an email, a survey with 3 to 5 questions after this to the iOS community, iOSoho at least. If you could please take a minute to answer, that would be super helpful for us. Next one. We have an upcoming meetup. We haven't done that for 3 months, and 3 months before that, we're trying to bring it back to life and try to have meetups every single month from now on. We're going to try to keep up with it. So, you know, we have a meetup already planned for May. We don't have a date yet, but it will be announced soon. So keep an eye on our meetups. We'll do another shared meetup. So keep an eye on that. And there will be a raffle with some prizes. So come back. Next one. As we said before, networking in a nutshell, there will be 4 different breakout rooms with teams. One of them will be for the talk you just heard. So if you didn't get a chance to ask a question to Krzysztof, he will be available for a little bit more time. So yeah, keep that in mind. You'll see after we move on, you can join any room. Basically, there will be 4 of them, and you can jump between rooms depending on what you want to talk about. One of them will be about WWDC. It's been announced. It's very soon. If you want to talk about it and ideate whatever, feel free to join. Another one is going to be for new meetup-comers. I know there are always new people joining, so if you want to meet with new members of the community, there will be a room for you. And the last one is going to be for people who might be either hiring or looking for a job. We'll have a room for that too. Yeah, and the last is your turn. If you would like to make an announcement yourself, whether it is about something like a side project you're working on, some open source initiative, and you're looking for contributors, some cool project you want to share, or even if you, I was going to say even if you're hiring, but for that, please keep the networking session. You have a chance to right now raise your hand and make a quick announcement. In order to move on and to the networking session, please keep it short.
And actually, I have a few from the DC
yeah,
iOS.
sure,
So while people raise their hands, I'll get a few from our side. So first, in collaboration with the rest of the DC community, that I'm going to post. First off, I posted the link to the YouTube page where at least DC iOS hosts all their meetup videos. I think, Paul, you have a separate one from yours. So just check there. We'll have this up hopefully by next week. Second, one of our co-groups, the DC Flutter and the GDG locally, they're doing another virtual meetup about using Flutter with AWS Amplify. I put the link there. Please be sure to check it out. And then the last one from our side is some of us who work at Capital One. We're helping to sponsor this month's iOS Dev Happy Hour, which is this Saturday. So if you've never been, it's a great time. It's a good chance to meet iOS developers around the world. If you want to find that out, I can dig out the Eventbrite link, or you can find it on Twitter. And then just, if you have some free time on Saturday, it's a great event. You get to meet anyone from around the world. All right, I see one announcement. I see one more announcement, so let me get that hand raised. All right.
Hey, everyone, can you hear me?
Yep, loud and clear.
Cool. All right, so my name is David Mitchell. I gave 2 talks to the iOSoho group over the past couple of years, one based on container view controllers and another based on multi-platform development for all of Apple's platforms. And just recently, in the past couple of weeks, I open sourced everything that those talks were based off of. So I have a framework that I've been doing iOS since 2009. So I have a framework and a template project that all those samples were based off of. And I do a lot of app development off of this framework as well. So it's been open sourced, and you are all free to take a look at it and provide feedback. And I'm going to paste a GitHub link to that on the chat window. So this is the projects are in there under the App Studio LLC account, and you're all free to go check it out. And that's it.
That's awesome. I would like to add that when David gave actually the first online meetup pandemic talk, so thanks for participating. When you say cross-platform or multi-platform is Apple platforms, right? Not iOS and Android. Your talk was about like developing for iOS and macOS and tvOS, right? This kind of multi-platform. I don't know, maybe you're muted, but
yeah.
Just so people know, it's not about iOS versus Android. That's it.
All right. Awesome. All right. So thank you, everyone. I'm going to stop the recording, and then we'll go to the breakout rooms. You should be free to move around them as you please. This main room will also be left open for any regular general chat. And I will probably end up ending the session around 6:35, 6:40. I'll make an announcement before we end the breakout rooms. Thank you, everyone.